Hi, I'm Douglas Rushkoff. I'm in a little suburban town of New York. Got all these medical things going on in my family, so I can't really travel around so much right now. But I'm here, you're there, so hey. Um, I guess what I want to share is the way in which the new media environment that we're in uh, really changes the landscape for the kinds of economic activity that we're talking about. Uh, from a lot of the conversations I saw leading up to this, people were talking about, well, if we have a platform co-op, does that also bring back some labor ideas? What does that mean about the commons? As if there are all these different strands that seem to want to come, they want to revive together. And I don't think it's a matter of deciding, well, what is real based on, well, if this aspect isn't there, then it's not real, or if this aspect isn't there, then it's not real, but rather to see in a media environment, in a new technological environment, um, a set of values and systems that may have been repressed the last time out tend to get retrieved together. So sometimes it's very cultural. It's, the medieval styles that you see in Burning Man or the industrial movement or Etsy or steampunk. And sometimes it's the medieval era economic mechanisms like local currency or the commons or guilds or worker ownership. So we'll see these things come, and then it's a matter. I think it's more a matter of celebrating that we have access to these systems, to these mechanisms, and hopefully new means of executing them. When the digital renaissance, as I like to call it, first began in the late 80s and early 90s, most of us who had really in the counterculture, who had come from the hippie movement or the psychedelic movement, we saw these tools as intrinsically liberating, particularly for the peer-to-peer for a peer-to-peer society. It just seemed natural and dare I say inevitable that would happen. I mean, and it seemed so inevitable that most of us actually embraced John Barlow's early Declaration of Cyberspace, which really admonished all nation states, all governance to stay back, and here we are in the new realm. We don't need you. And it said a lot of mean things about government, which we were angry at the time because they had been arresting hackers and really fumbling their way through early internet culture. But it said nothing about companies, about corporations. And of course, what happens when you get rid of government specifically, but don't get rid of corporations, corporations grow out of control. They tend to balance each other in the real world, or try to, almost like fungus and bacteria will balance each other in a biological system. So you get rid of all the fungus, all the government, and then corporations grow out of control. So, instead of getting a retrieval of these peer-to-peer values that most of us thought would sort of naturally and inevitably come, we got an extension and amplification of industrialism and financialization, and the marketplace moved into increasingly abstract realms rather than more terrestrial ones. And as I understand digital technology, it can lead to extreme abstraction, but I think unfettered, it actually promotes a much more local sensibility. When I look at Occupy and Arab Spring and the internet culture, I don't see these global global initiatives, these kind of television era global protests against the WTO or something. I see highly localized connections between people. But instead of getting that, we got the opposite. We got this amplification of the abstract marketplace. We got digital companies which exist to further financialization. Most digital companies, certainly after the first month, once the founder, finds his venture capital, they pivot over into really just a race toward IPO, which has nothing to do with the application creating value or even having a sustainable market. It's just about the application being able to establish a platform monopoly and then sell its stock to an acquiring company or on an IPO, which is not real business, right? This is just an extension of the dying Nasdaq Stock Exchange and a method of doing business that's purely extractive and non-productive. It's one where capital has the only voice at the table, and land and labor, the other, I would argue, more important factors of production, aren't allowed to do anything. So it's no wonder when you listen to capital and don't listen to land and labor, you end up with land that's destroyed in the middle of climate change and labor that's utterly disenfranchised. And eventually, though, and I'm hopeful on this in a apocalyptic sort of way, I guess, it reaches a breaking point. It reaches a point where that economic system can no longer support the people or the planet, and people start looking to alternatives. The beauty, though, is that while the current economy doesn't seem to be exploiting all of the mechanisms that have potentially been retrieved, what you do see in a renaissance such as ours is these mechanisms eventually coming to the fore, eventually rising to take the place of the mechanisms that died or that are dying. I mean, this is what we saw in the first Renaissance. I mean, it wasn't pretty, but the first Renaissance, really the one we all talk about. I don't know if it was the first, but the big Renaissance repressed peer-to-peer economics. It repressed the early marketplace, the early bazaar that had brought down feudalism, and was really constructed in order to prevent the rise of a peer-to-peer middle class. The bazaar, the marketplace, had allowed for former peasants to begin trading amongst one another, and we got the most dramatic growth economy we've ever seen, and distributed growth. I mean, so the problem with that, of course, was the aristocracy got poor as the peasants were getting wealthy. So they implemented mechanisms to repress peer-to-peer economics, to repress the commons and enclose that, to make it impossible for people to work and create and exchange value, and instead forced people to work for companies, chartered monopolies, and to use central currency at interest. So all of the peer-to-peer mechanisms of exchange were repressed in favor of larger corporations and centralized currency. And people lived under this, and eventually Marx kind of figured this out and said, wait a minute, this really doesn't work. These bad guys, these capitalists are, extracting value from all of the workers, and has to be changed. And interestingly enough, the church was asked to comment on this, the Catholic Church. And they came up with something that I feel like we're just getting in touch with today. They came up with an idea called distributism. And what they said was, well, look, Marx is right, and in some ways the capitalists are right. The capitalists are right. People are allowed to own things privately and make money and earn profits if they want, but it's not fair, it's not right to extract value from people and places and to disenfranchise labor like this and disconnect people from the value they're creating. So they came up with a notion that they called distributism, which really just says that workers should own the means of production. That is, the worker should either own the tools that he or she's using to make the thing that they make, or a body of workers should own the factory that they're using. And it's platform cooperative, 200 years ago or 100 years ago that they were sort of dancing around a little bit or trying to express. The other main tenet of the distributist system that the church was arguing for was something they called subsidiarity. And subsidiarity stated that no business should be larger than it needs to be in order to do its actual business. So you don't grow a business for growth's sake. You don't grow a business in order to satisfy an artificially inflated debt structure, which is basically what it means when you have shareholders or a purely shareholder-driven business. You only grow as large as you need to be to do the thing that you do. So even if it's a pizzeria in your town, you grow large enough to serve pizza to your town. But if the next town over needs a pizzeria, you don't expand, you don't franchise, you let them build a pizzeria in their town. And once growth is no longer a mandate, because ideally we're not all borrowing central currency at massive interest and need to pay up interest in order just to stay still, you can have businesses that are scaled to marketplaces rather than businesses that are scaled to the needs of capital. And finally, of course, the church, these are medievalists. That's what the Catholics are. They look back at the moment when the Commons was enclosed in England as the beginning of the end, and in some ways they're right. Although yes, it was a corruptly maintained Commons, at least the notion of a Commons, the idea of a Commons, that we're all going to graze our cattle on this pasture, and we have a limit on how much we can graze, and that there's governance and there's punishment. At least that was embedded in the fabric of society. Now it's completely foreign. Now when you say Commons to someone, they think about a public toilet where people pee all over the seat and saying, well, see, the failure of the Commons. It doesn't work. No one takes care of it if nobody's. They don't understand it at all. Now, just because the church argued that these things could happen, that distributism and subsidiarity and the Commons were superior ways of managing resources and keeping workers connected to the value they create, and reducing the role of shareholders' financialization and abstraction on our marketplaces, which end up destroying the land and alienating humans from one another, they didn't really have the means to execute this because we were living in a highly centralized industrial culture. Now, digital, I think that digital does enable these more networked and I don't even want to call them decentralized, but distributed means of value creation. Whether it's blockchain and record keeping, we can now manage a network of smaller businesses. The closest model I can see is almost the early dreams of the anarcho-syndicalist network of worker-owned cottage industries. That when I see a digital age, that's what I see is not these sort of giant centralized computer-driven Googleplexes or these massive obese collections of capital, but a much more the ability to synchronize and coordinate a larger network of businesses. Sort of the problems that a Mondragon might be facing now as they are operating at this tremendous scale really can be solved with better local networked administration. But I think it's really important to see the possibilities much less as potentials unleashed by the technologies themselves, by digital technology, than by the hands-on ethos of the digital media environment, if you know what I mean. So I'm saying, if we overdo the digital aspect of this, how is technology making this happen? It's really hard not to fall into the value system where we think of human beings in terms of their utility value, or we value automation over human production because automation seems to be faster or seems to be producing more things more quickly, when it's really just externalizing the costs more invisibly. The real goal of this renaissance or this economic movement, as I see it, is to restore land and labor to the factors of production rather than just capital. We bring land back into it. So just as we want the drivers of Uber to be part shareholders in the Uber network, what about the place where what about the roads on which the Uber cars are driving? What about the air in which the Amazon drones are flying? That these are publicly owned or people owned or sacredly owned real resources. When it's when we bring land into and everything that land means back into the factors of production that we start to understand the real need for commonsing, or understanding the principles of commons in order to negotiate our collective use of those things. But the principle retrieved value of a digital age really is the hands-onness, the willingness for people to actually execute. The local emphasis of digital really restores these actors, the actors of land and labor, and reduces the importance of the utterly abstracted ones. So when I guess that's really my main barometer, my main litmus test for as I'm kind of feeling through proposals and new businesses and new mechanisms is, are they local? Are they hands-on? Are they reconnecting people to place? Are they restoring the value received for value created rather than just money given for time donated? And as I use those litmus tests, I actually start to feel really positive that people are almost instinctually or intuitively moving towards these much more stable business opportunities rather than just being enamored by the latest blockchain gizmo, which always stands the danger of either abstracting our efforts or letting them be co-opted before their time.